How's that volume level? Everybody hear me in back okay? I kind of talk a little loud anyway, so hopefully they won't be too loud. So good morning. Welcome to the first session of the design track. My name is Nate Koechley. I'm from Yahoo. Today we're going to look at kind of some things we learned doing 3 different kind of Ajax implementations. But before we get started, the talks are nice at conferences, but I think a lot of the value of conferences comes from meeting everybody else and talking to everybody else and everything that happens in the hallway. So to kind of set you guys off doing that a little bit, I just want to take 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and have you guys just talk to the person next to you, figure out where they're from, what kind of work they do, so that you can figure that out. So you can continue that once we're done with this later on. So 2 minutes, I'm going to finish getting ready. All right, good job, good job. Hopefully we'll get a lot more of that throughout the next couple days. There's a lot to learn from each other as well as from some of the other speakers here, so good job. Thanks for indulging me with that. Anyway, so I work on the Yahoo user interface library team. How many people are familiar with the JavaScript library we open sourced a couple months ago? So I work on that team. I also spent a couple years at Yahoo working for our platform design team, and so now my job is kind of both, to make sure that our designers are using the things that we're developing and that we're developing the things the designers want. So today I'm in platform engineering, but I kind of wear both hats. All the slides will be up on my blog after this, as well as through the conference. And I guess we'll look at those other URLs later on. Uh-oh. Get back. Let's try that again. So I was the first web developer at Yahoo about 5 years ago. And before that, we didn't have any web developers. We didn't have anybody focused on kind of client-side work, front-end work, making the interface really as fast and as performant and as sophisticated as possible. Spent some time in the trenches working on search and shopping and travel and a couple others, and managed a team of developers as our department grew. Like I said, I'm on the YUI library team now. And kind of a pretty strange role. I do things like this. I work on I write our blog and worry about browser specs. And being there so long and kind of working in this kind of central role is really interesting because I get to kind of see across the company. I'm not really heads down on any one project, but I get to kind of pay attention to a lot of things that are going on. And so looking across the company, we have these 3 kind of premier Ajax implementations. And so I went and I interviewed a lot of those developers and designers and pulled out a couple things. Before we get into that, though, I have to quickly plug the YUI library. I just want to point out some of the things that are sometimes overlooked. And there's a whole session on this tomorrow for more of the details and the capabilities and how to use it and stuff. But it's at developer.yahoo.com. This is the home page. We've been getting a lot of good response from all our efforts in documentation. We have kind of Java doc style API documentation for all the components. We have a whole series of cheat sheets for every piece of the library. We have a 3,000 or 5,000 member news group now where a lot of discussion is going on about different implementations, different challenges people are having. All the engineers on my team respond to those messages every day. We write a blog kind of about design and about development. It's got two different channels, design and development. And then we also, in conjunction with the interface library, we also have a design patterns library, which is kind of common solutions to common problems. Some pretty interesting things there for designers. We distribute everything through SourceForge and track bugs and everything there. But enough about that. You can come back tomorrow or catch me in between, and we can dig into there. So Alex Russell, Mr. Dojo, has written this DHTML universe map. And it's a work in progress. It's totally incomplete. But I just wanted to walk through it real quickly. Starting at the left, we've got Windows and some of the Google guys, JS DOM and some other libraries, Alex Russell and Dojo organization. We've got Backbase, Flickr, Scriptaculous, Prototype, Doug Crockford and some of his work, JSMin and JSDoc, Zimbra and Tibco. And of that entire universe, slides are really jumpy. We've got a whole bunch of those people at Yahoo. So I'm not the world's best developer, and the stuff I'm talking about today isn't all my work, but it's really all these other people whose brain power is all kind of contributing to this. So all the praise for anything goes to them, and any blame comes from me and how I may present it. So a quick history. Yahoo in '94. For any fans of semantic markup or web standards, it doesn't get more kind of web standards than this. An unordered list and a bunch of links just kind of is what it is. That's how we started in '94. This is before we even had the exclamation point. And as you can see, only under 32,000 links on the web back then that we were aware of. So we've come a long way in the last 12 years. By a year later, we had put the first graphic on the page. And interestingly, as soon as we put the first graphic up, we already had a text-only version. Not sure how much value that really brought, but still it really shows, we've always had this interest in kind of being there for everybody, being really inclusive, being really accessible. So not much has changed here. I guess there's the first table, putting the lists into 2 columns, but still pretty simple, just links. 2 more years pass, and 2 years in internet time is a long time. And still not much has changed. A few more graphics, I guess the first ad, for better or worse. Rolled out some of the international localized versions. 3 more years passed, still nothing's really changed. Another column, a few more colors, a few more properties, many more links. So now it's been up there for 8 years, looks about the same, getting more and more busy and reaching out around the world as more and more people come online. This is 2002, this is post kind of crash. But really the thing to note here is that it's still basically the same. And then this is until a few months ago, this was the homepage that we offered. Familiar to many of you, I hope. Still about the same. There it is a little bit closer, I guess. This is how it was this spring. Almost 200 million users a month. Over 5 billion page views a month. Largest page on the internet. Still not much has changed, though, in 10 years' time. And this is the homepage today. Pretty radically different. We've got tons of DHTML, tons of Ajax, a lot of, you can view things in place, you can look at all this different content. Over on the right, we have this personal assistant module. You can tab through different things and paginate through your messenger contacts and look at different radio stations, browse and get kind of pop-up information about a bunch of different movies, kind of carousel through those, look at the weather, pipe in maps and do drag and drop maps right on the home page, trigger, figure out what events are going on nearby, get traffic live on the map. This is all on the home page. 200 million users, 5 billion page views a month around the world. And what's interesting about that to me is that we didn't change for so long, and now we're finally able to change. So it isn't just a buzzword. It was good enough for something like the front page of Yahoo. So that shows that it's not just a buzz. It's here to stay. It's viable. It's business ready. It works everywhere. It's doable. So, like I was saying, it's just a big shift. It's worth taking note of. It's worth being aware of. And for us, it's really a shift from content delivery to really doing software development. We're not just putting HTML on a page. We're actually writing software that lives in the browser that users interact with. Unfortunately, the browser is the most hostile environment possible for writing software, so it's a bit of a challenge. Even given those challenges, though, and given the kind of emergent things that we're working on, it's still viable in this kind of case. And when you're working at the scale we're working at, the interesting thing is that our edge cases are massive populations. That 0.5% is millions and millions of people. So there's no 90% is good enough. There's no, oh, who cares about those few people? We have to care about everybody. And so I think that says a lot when you're trying to convince your organization that it's go time for all this new stuff, that it works for us, that it works in these, across this huge scale. Not really going to talk about Web 2.0 much except to offer my favorite definition of it. My buddy at work, Matt Sweeney, coined this term, but he says Web 2.0 is getting it right the second time. We've made, we were so constrained by the browser and by the technology and by the pipe that users were connecting to us with that we just made a lot of kind of bad choices. We had nested tables and font tags and page refreshes when there shouldn't have been and millions of other things. So all this renewed focus, all this excitement online now is really an opportunity, I think, to kind of start from scratch, and not from scratch necessarily, but to start over, to take pause, to think about what we're doing, and really kind of get it right for this entire next generation. So that's all kind of, I guess, the preamble. So these are the 3 case studies we're going to look at. One is the Yahoo homepage itself, and then Yahoo Photos, which is still in beta, I think, and Yahoo Mail, which just came out of beta recently, I believe. Maybe not, I guess that was Maps. But anyway, so Yahoo Photos, I guess most people in here are probably Flickr fans, but Yahoo Photo has like 10x the number of users as Flickr does. And actually some really pretty slick functionality in the new version that we're going to take a look at. So when we redid the homepage, we've got a huge team of people working on a single page, which is itself fairly interesting. But we did it all from scratch. It was just one page, so we didn't have a lot of legacy things to work with. So we made all our decisions kind of from a blank slate. I already mentioned the scale, and like I said, heavy kind of DHTML and Ajax. We already looked at this video of how of some of the functionality. Yahoo Photos, also from scratch, a really kind of collaborative effort between designers and developers. We find that's really an important thing these days because there's a lot of new technology that designers aren't necessarily aware of, or design patterns that technologists aren't familiar with, and so really having that kind of collaborative development process is really key. So they use agile methodology, which we're kind of piloting around Yahoo a little bit. They have 30 million users, I guess, right now. For those of you who haven't played with it, here's a little video of some of the functionality, kind of standard menus and stuff, edit in place like we're used to on, we just expect on photo sites these days. One of my favorite features is the selection model. So just like on the desktop, you do marquee selection, just drag things right up to the toolbar that follows you around. Even when you're off the page and you drag things, the toolbar shows up. You can shift-click and control-click, and kind of all those patterns you're used to on the desktop, you can now do on the browser. A shift-click to pick the whole range, and then go back and control-click and drag them up there to perform actions on them. Easy preview kind of pattern, and some other ones. So some really neat things in there you might want to check out and play with. And then the third one is Yahoo Mail. Even though it's still in beta and even though it's still pretty new, it's actually really legacy code. We acquired a company called Oddpost, which began developing this code base in '99 as an IE-only application. And so we're still kind of burdened by that legacy code. We didn't have the opportunity to start fresh. And so when we look at some of the deltas and choices we made, you'll see that kind of rear its head. Also just huge. And I'm not trying to hype up the stats or anything other than to say that we're under a lot of pressure to get these things right. We've got a lot of users depending on this, and so it has to work. We can't really be making too many guesses. Localized around the world, and in my opinion, it's really kind of the preeminent application. We're going to look at things from documents to applications, and I think this is way on the edge of the scale of what an application can be online. Again, for those who haven't had a chance to play with it, everything you'd kind of expect from an Outlook-type client. Nothing ever refreshes. You can preview everything kind of in place. There's a whole kind of internal tab system, so you can be writing and reading and working with a bunch of different messages at one time without kind of leaving your same application. Autocomplete, which is a really powerful pattern. There's a little Easter egg in there. If you don't know what subject your email should be, you can just tick the button and it'll make something up for you. Let's see. Yeah, so you can do live search kind of in place, which just shows up as another tab. Although I think I've got a lot of messages with that string, so it takes a little minute. Anyway, so just an application. It looks, some people get confused in usability studies. People forget that they're kind of online, we found. RSS and calendar and just kind of everything right there. Not a product pitch, though. We're here to talk about kind of the tech underneath. So all these projects, even though they're kind of different, even though they're across this spectrum, kind of have some common goals. The first is performance. Performance is key. We want to be, performance is key. It kind of has a couple different meanings, though. One is how fast can we paint the page, which is different than how long does it take until the onload event fires. Users don't really care about kind of absolute performance time. They want to know how fast it feels. And so as soon as we can get something on the screen, that's a really important measure of time and of speed. We also care about how fast things are going over the wire, how much data we're pushing, how fast we can get server responses and start getting that data stream going, which means we want to have as lightweight as possible and as kind of chunked into reasonable pieces as possible. Equally important is speed of development. Development takes a lot of resources, and so we don't want to suffer from that. We want to still be able to be really adaptive and quick. And then increasingly important in today's world of software in the browser is kind of memory usage and CPU usage. How are we pinning the user's processor all the time? Are we doing too much computation on the client side instead of back on the server side? So performance means all of those things to me. The second goal is interactivity. Ajax is about giving people a more responsive interface and just kind of more tools, more power at their fingertips. So just increasing interactivity as much as possible. Oops. And then finally, just to make good choices. We don't want to be burdening ourselves with, we don't want to make decisions today that give us constraints down the road. Even though we're under a lot of pressure to do new things and to innovate and to try out all this new emergent technology, we still want to stay true to our roots and true to what we know is right, true to kind of web standards and appropriate layered development and these other things that are important. A lot of that's under pressure because of all this excitement, because our product managers and our bosses are demanding more and more from us. But even when that happens, it's still really important to stick to kind of our guns about what we think is good on the web. So here's some of the things that are kind of more or less in common. So the ones in bold are the ones that are kind of our recommendations, even if there's some variance among the others. So we always write HTML 4.01 strict for our doc type, which throws us into strict rendering mode instead of Quirks mode in the browser. Yahoo Mail was legacy, like I said, and so they don't do this, and they kind of pay the price in some areas. Photos has a pretty kind of hardcore geek development team, and so they went all the way with XHTML, but there's not really a lot to gain there. Everybody's using CSS sprites, which is a great technique to reduce HTTP requests, put many images into a single image file. For accessibility and usability, we believe it's really important for the user to be able to adjust their font size and to have the interface grow with that font size adjustment. It's really easy these days, or feasible these days, to allow keyboard interaction, keyboard navigation. So you type R in Mail, and it initiates a reply. And on home page, you can jump to the search box or jump to the weather box and various other kind of keyboard shortcuts. We're not doing any absolute positioning. We tried that with CSS for a little while and some various designs, and it doesn't really work that well at the end of the day. That's absolute to the body node. We still do absolute within kind of regions of the page. And then as far as code over the wire goes, we minimize everything, which means stripping white space, stripping comments out of our JavaScript and CSS files. But we don't do obfuscation anymore. When Mail was their own company, Oddpost, they were really sensitive and protective of their intellectual property in their code because it was so new. So they obfuscated things, but it's our opinion that when you obfuscate things, you introduce bugs, and we have enough bugs already, so it's not worth any kind of potential savings. And you make up for any potential weight gain when you start doing compression. So all of our servers send out gzip compression files. So the combination of minimization plus compression ends up saving us about 80% of the file weight. So a 10K JavaScript file will go down to 2K or something like that. On our blog, Doug Crockford, who's our JavaScript architect, wrote a piece about this you can reference. So I alluded to the spectrum from documents to applications, from kind of web pages to kind of web apps and our rich internet applications. And I kind of picked a little bit about kind of that spread. Pages are the web. The web's about distributing content first and foremost. That's kind of how it was imagined. Now we're bringing the desktop richness into the browser, which really allows for much deeper interaction. You can just be on this one page of photos and do a ton of manipulations and modifications to your content right there. So really from simple idioms, kind of peck and click and point and click, to really much deeper idioms now. People are used to kind of inline search and all these other keyboard controls and edit in place and kind of more rich patterns. From reading to doing, from markup to DOM, kind of from sequential page to really contained applications in some place, and from kind of passive to active. And so kind of across that spectrum, from pages and documents to applications, I kind of picked these three products because I think they kind of represent three different spots. Even though there's a bunch of interactivity on the home page now, it's still a page. And at the far extreme is Mail, which is a quintessential application. And Photos is in the middle. Each photo has a permalink, and you can access that page itself, or you can come into the application and interact with your content there. So it's a little bit of both. So as we kind of move across that spectrum, there were really 6 things that jumped out at me that were interesting to talk about. These are them: events, memory, delivering stuff, data formats, pagination, and browser support. So we'll go through those 6. Starting with tracking events. So the other way to look at what's happening now is we're really moving from kind of page granularity. You're on a page, you do something. You're on another page, you do something, another page, to really event-based, event-driven interfaces. I've highlighted something. Now all these new options become possible. And so events are really key to DHTML and to Ajax and to everything we're having fun with right now. So the first thing to keep in mind when you're dealing with events is to pretty much always use an event utility, which will help out with some of the, which helps primarily by keeping JavaScript out of your markup. As we've separated CSS from markup, we also want to separate JavaScript out so that none of your behavior is stuck in your content layer or in your presentation layer. And so with an event utility, you can go in and you can add listeners to different nodes. And there's a couple gotchas there, and so using an event utility you get a lot of things for free. Dojo has a great one. Our YUI library has a nice event utility. There's tons more out there. Another advantage to using a utility is that it really helps you kind of manage memory leaks. Has anybody encountered any memory leaks with IE if they've been doing any kind of event programming? There's tons of them. You have to be aware of them. You have to be less aware of them if you're using a utility, which does a lot of the cleanup kind of for you. So here's the traditional model of kind of event attachment. You've got a whole bunch of objects on the page, and you crawl through the DOM, and you attach your event to each of them, which works fine until your app gets really complex. So you've got all these events, and now you've got all these objects, and when you put those two together, you're really pushing the browser to the breaking point. Something like this. And we're not really feeling lucky. So what we want to do is minimize this object and event count. So the way to do that, it seems, is to instead of tracking each object and each event like this, instead of having each object have its attached events, sometimes many events, sometimes a key event and a mouse event and a drag event and a bunch of them, we want to take those events off the objects and put them up at a higher layer and then delegate the events after that. So instead of event attachment, we're now starting to do event delegation in more complex applications. So instead of listening to every node, every DOM node, we're only listening kind of up higher, sometimes on the document itself, sometimes on a certain region of the page. And we'll just listen for the mouse down, then determine what's underneath that click further down in the DOM, and then right just in the nick of time, attach the event that we care about. There's that image again of kind of my best way to graphically represent it, I suppose. For any coders, this is kind of what's happening in pseudocode. Instead of looking at every granular event, we're listening to the parent event. We're capturing that click. As soon as we get the click, we do a native method called getTarget to figure out, of all these photos in my thumbnail gallery, which one did I click on top of? And then once I determine that, then programmatically attach the event right at the last second. That way they're not taking up all the memory space until like the instant you need them. It takes a little bit more code to kind of have this delegation logic, but in a complex application, it's well worth the time. We kind of have an example of this on down at that URL you can check out later for a more realistic code sample. There is that extra associated overhead and kind of, in a way, brittleness that you get when you start doing this. So it doesn't make sense on something less complex like a page. But as you move across to applications, you're going to have to start doing this to have a kind of a sane level of kind of memory consumption. So I alluded to memory management, and things really do get out of hand as you start using a lot of memory on purpose and also starting to leak some memory. Memory consumption is kind of the opposite of performance. If you start using too much and things get really heavy, performance degrades really quickly. As I said, that's one of our top goals, is to be performant and to be fast. And so that's why this is so important. So the most important thing to do is for every constructor you have, every time you're attaching an event, every time you're constructing a new node, every time you're initiating a new XHR request or something along those lines, you want to be really thorough about going in and unhooking it and destroying those references when you're done with them so they don't kind of linger in space and kind of consume memory. Garbage collection is not the best online, and so you kind of have to go in and manually kind of do a lot of that. And so DOM destruction is the right thing to do in 99% of the cases. And there's two other cases, though, that are kind of interesting just to keep in the back of your mind. And in those cases, we kind of do conservation and recycling. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. I guess I'll tell you right here. So on the home page, there's all that hidden functionality. And in the video, you saw how you could trigger maps, and the drag and drop maps would show up. And even before that, on the different news stories, you had the entertainment and sports, and each of those had 4 different highlights. And so there, because we want that page to be the fastest of all, and because people are using different pieces of it all the time, we don't have any of that DOM on the page initially. So that the story, the hidden stories or the hidden map doesn't exist until a user initiates it. Once they have initiated it, in most cases, in other properties, we would destroy that content again to reclaim that memory space. But on the home page, in the interest of performance, we actually never destroy anything. So once they've clicked to the entertainment tab, we keep all those things in memory for when they come back. We're able to do this because it's a page and because they're going to use the page and then leave, and we'll reclaim all the memory then. And so it's really kind of a short time span interaction. So there, just so they can click around and it feels super responsive, we want to keep all that stuff in memory. In Yahoo Photos, they just destroy everything. Once you've paginated to a second 100 set of photos, for instance, the first 100 get totally cleared out of memory. Once you take something out of that tray, they destroy those nodes and take that memory back. Yahoo Mail does the same thing in all cases except one, and that's for iframes. So we looked at the internal kind of tab system, so you can open up multiple messages at once. Each of those exists in its own iframe because we need to protect HTML email messages from inheriting our CSS. It's advantageous if they're their own document. But there's a lot of overhead with iframes because they are documents. The browser has to, it's almost analogous to opening a new tab or opening a new instance. You're paying for all that overhead of a new document. And so when we first instantiate Mail, we create, I think, 12 iframes to have a library of them. And then we populate them with different messages as people use them. But when people are done using them, instead of destroying them, we just clear them out. So we clear all their contents, but we keep the iframe itself in existence so that we can reuse it again. So we recycle those heavier objects like iframes. In general, though, the takeaway here is to destroy everything that you create and to unhook any events you attach. The YUI event utility does all that for you for free. As you're leaving the page, it'll automatically unattach all your events and reclaim all those pointers, I guess. And so even if you're conceptually doing all the right things, you really need to measure and to pay attention to what's happening. There's a tool called Drip, which is really good for doing this. Most of the problems exist for IE. Drip focuses on IE. As you're trying to measure and as you're trying to test, you want to look for three things. The first is kind of extreme object counts. So what happens when I have 10,000 email messages? A lot of times in development, we just have lorem ipsum text on the page, and it's not really representative of a real user's data set. So you want to put a whole bunch of photos in there, put a whole bunch of news stories in there, or RSS feeds, or whatever your content is. Test that. The other important thing to test is long interactions. So a lot of memory leaks are really kind of small, and so you need to have maybe 100 interactions or leave it open for a few hours and see if there's any incremental leaks that are starting to collect. And then the third one is the most overlooked, and that is kind of navigation-based memory leaks. So sometimes when you leave a page, a little bit of memory won't be reclaimed. And then when you come back, that'll kind of multiply, and then you leave again. So it's not just within the context of a page. You want to make sure that you're going down a whole cycle to go through back, forward, back, forward, back, forward, and see if that's generating anything. But if you have a measurement tool, there's some great ones for Firefox also. You want to make sure you're testing those three things. If you're using event utility and doing that, you'll be in great shape. There's a link to Drip for posterity. Number three is actually delivering JavaScript and CSS files. I mentioned earlier about CSS sprites, which is a technique for putting many images into a single file. We like doing that for images when we can. But this is about JavaScript and CSS. We just blogged about this last week, and we've got a few more in our performance series coming. But a single large file is the fastest. The worst thing for your site is multiple HTTP requests. So everything you can do to reduce the number of HTTP requests is really key to having a performance site. And then more specifically, we discovered these two things. That you want to have your CSS really at the top of your page, somewhere in the head of your document. And it turns out that for the fastest performance, we want to put the JavaScript as low in the file as possible. So right before the closing body element, or the closing body tag. Of course, you have to be aware kind of your application. You have to know what's going on. You don't want your JavaScript, you don't want your application to be dead until it gets there. So sometimes we'll load the necessary JavaScript first, and then the bulk of the JavaScript later. Part of the reason why this is because JavaScript files only load one at a time. So in general, browsers have parallel tracks. They'll pull in 2 assets at a time per host name. But with JavaScript, because it has the ability to manipulate the DOM and change what's then therefore needed, the browser locks everything down and only brings in one file at a time. So if you have a big file at the top of your page, it's going to hit that start downloading it and do nothing else until it finishes. And like I said, we want to paint the page as fast as possible. We want to give our users something to see, something to interact with. And so we don't like to have that kind of dead time while it's bringing in potentially unnecessary JavaScript. So if your application, if it makes sense in your case, if your application can afford to wait a minute for that JavaScript, put it all the way at the end is kind of the way to go. So again, that's about 90% of the time. There's 3 other kind of edge cases. In some cases, it's nice to have a lot of small files and to bring them in all at once. This really, so maybe somebody's working on the autocomplete code and somebody else is working on the tab navigation code or something like that. So sometimes the team benefits of having kind of atomic development are worth it. You can have one person doing this, one person doing that. You don't have a real sophisticated build process to bring it back together necessarily. So there are some reasons why kind of all at once makes sense. Another kind of potential reason is because you don't want to make one small modification to a file and then throw away everything that may be cached. So if you have one file that is changing every day, maybe there's some dynamic information coming in through a JavaScript file. Maybe you want to keep that one separate and then have your more stable JavaScript in another file. It's 2 possibilities. Another way to use small files is to do it kind of on demand. So think back to the home page again. All the JavaScript for the drag and drop map, most users aren't going to interact with the map every time they come to the home page. And so we don't want to have everybody pay that price. So once we see a user initiate the map, then we go get those JavaScript files. So kind of on-demand loading for kind of lesser used functionality. And then the third approach is to actually put the JavaScript in the page itself, just inline in the head of the document. Unfortunately, caching doesn't always work. It works much less frequently than we'd expect. I butted heads with one of our researchers for a while when he was telling me this, because I just wanted to believe that we've all learned that you put external files and they're cached and life is grand. But it doesn't actually work that way. We're only seeing caching in about 60% of the time. We'll have some more stats on that next week again on the blog. But and it's particularly the case if the home button of a browser is programmed to that page. Every time you hit home, every time you hit Control New, like a lot of people do with Yahoo.com, nothing is cached. It pulls in everything fresh. So in that case, they're not going to cache it anyway. Maybe this is the case with your intranet or some other product or some sales tool, something else where it's probably your user's homepage. If that's the case, then in those cases it makes sense to have it right in the head so you can avoid that extra HTTP request, which isn't going to give you any benefit through caching down the road. Again, 90% of the time, one big external file, but these are other things to keep in mind. So who's doing what? This is just a summary again. Many small files on demand with a little bit inline on the home page. Yahoo Mail is kind of an anti-example again because it's a sort of legacy and their code base is pretty nuts. But they just have one single file. Partially because a lot of their interaction or a lot of the different tools are tied together. So the autocomplete is tied in with the search. And so having everything together kind of makes sense. So data formats. Ajax, accessible JavaScript and XML. But we actually think it's Ajax lowercase, not Ajax uppercase. The XML isn't really a key to the process. The asynchronous is the key. So we actually use JSON a lot, which is JavaScript object notation. Douglas calls it the fat-free alternative to XML. It's a JavaScript format. It's a subset of JavaScript. So he claims he discovered it, not that he invented it, because it kind of just is a pattern that exists within JavaScript data structures. But the nice thing about it is you don't have to crawl anything, you don't have to parse anything, you don't have to iterate over XML nodes to try to get the interesting data. You get a JSON object, it's just native JavaScript data that you can act with immediately. So developers love it. You just get the data and immediately it's in those JavaScript variables for you to write to the page. And in almost every case, it's much lighter weight than XML because of the format. At json.org, you'll find parsers and producers for just about every known programming language. In fact, quite a few that I didn't even know about. So it works with everything. It's interpretable by just about everybody. It's still fairly human readable. So we've had great success using it. So that's kind of the default. Now some other approaches. It's worth keeping in mind that somebody has to pay the price to kind of render the view. You can either have your server side do it and figure out kind of what the state will be, or you can pass all that data to the client and let the client kind of decide what to build. In some cases, it's faster to do a lot of that processing on the server to determine kind of what the state will be, what this message set will be on the server. Use that CPU processor and write out a whole, instead of just passing data down, you can actually write out a whole HTML fragment and send that down just as a string and just inner HTML it right to the page. In a lot of cases, that makes sense. In a lot of other cases, it makes sense to send data and to construct those things on the client side. So it's one of the most important kind of architectural decisions these days as you're kind of figuring out what your system's going to look like is kind of where is this processing going to happen. Interestingly, and if somebody has anything to add about this, I'd love to hear it afterwards. But we find that XML performance degrades more than linearly as it gets big. So as it gets big or it gets slower, kind of faster than you would expect. So if you're doing large data sets, be extra kind of wary of XML. The home page using JSON everywhere. Photos, they had a kind of a long development cycle, and so they had a lot of architecture in place before we really jumped fully on board with JSON. And then mail is kind of a hodgepodge. They're doing some JSON passing and some string passing, some XML passing. So again, like you really just have to know what your application is. It's all about knowing what your DOM is going to look like, what your application is going to look like, what your users are going to be expecting, what your server system is. Can you afford that extra crunching on the server, or would you rather offload it to the client? So JSON's great, but you have to do your own analysis. Pagination. One of the key things to keep in mind, I think, these days, and I spend a lot of time meeting with project managers and designers and everybody really, is that just because we can do things doesn't mean we should do things. There's a lot of, drag and drop doesn't belong everywhere. Ajax pagination doesn't belong everywhere. Fill in the blank doesn't belong everywhere. So the important things to know, I said this before, know your footprint, know how heavy your application is, kind of where the processing is happening, know your DOM, know what your page is looking like from the browser's perspective, and then know what your users are kind of expecting. Ajax pagination and kind of its cousin, endless scrolling, are really nice patterns, though. And so we see it being used in Yahoo Mail. They use endless scrolling. So I've got 20,000 email messages, and I can just drag the scroll bar and jump anywhere within that data set. On the home page, we saw my list of messenger buddies or my email messages, and you can paginate through those sets. Next 10, next 10. That's all Ajax pagination. It really seems to depend on the weight of your objects. So in photos, each thumbnail with all the metadata, with the title and the description, ends up being a pretty heavy object. So they're really conscious of their memory consumption. And so there's 100, I think it's 100 photos on the page, maybe it's 200. And then at the bottom, there's pagination. And it's still Ajax pagination. The URL bar doesn't change. You're still on the same page. But when you go to the next 100, instead of an endless scrolling pattern, it's a pagination pattern. So I hit next. It throws away all 200 of those objects from memory. Go gets another 100 or 200 and rebuilds it all. So they take that pagination moment as an opportunity to kind of clean up the workspace and restart with a fresh data set. In contrast, mail has really light objects. They're just message headers, the subject and the to from. And so those are really lightweight and really easy to scroll through all those. Question?
Yeah, I'm wondering, in that situation that you described, do you really see much of a benefit in doing that kind of pagination with Ajax versus just going back to the server and throwing away?
So the question is, is it when you're trying to reclaim the memory space, like in photos, and you're still doing pagination, you're getting another 100, is it worth it to even do Ajax at all at that point? It's a fine question. I think for us, for photos, the answer is yes, because we have so much kind of in the Chrome. The whole application exists on the page. You saw how you could drag photos up to the toolbar. So instead of rebuilding that on refresh, we want to leave that all there, not really change the user's perspective, just give them new data to interact with. That's a good question. So again, the underlying current here is you have to make your own decisions, but these are some kind of considerations and some of our experience. And then browser support is kind of near and dear to my heart, so I wanted to talk about that briefly. Is anybody familiar with graded browser support as a concept? Yeah, a couple of people? So I mentioned before that quote was attributed to Douglas again. He's been really influential since he joined Yahoo about 1.5 years ago. He's a sharp guy, and like I said, he's our top kind of front-end architect. But so he acknowledges that the web is the most hostile software engineering environment imaginable, and I think you guys probably all have a similar feeling. And because of the browsers, because we have to support all these different browsers. So how many people have had this question asked of them or asked this question themselves? Do I have to support this browser on this project? Always kind of a binary question, yes or no, yes or no. And when you're saying that, you're saying the same thing as that, no, those users aren't welcome. You don't have to support them, which is synonymous for, just forget about them. And we really believe, partially because of the size of our user base and the size of our edge cases, but also because I think it's just fundamental to the web to think otherwise, that's not an appropriate thing to say. We want to welcome everybody. We believe everybody should be able to access content and tools online. So we made two key thoughts in getting away from that binary approach towards a more graded approach to browser support. The first is that support doesn't mean the same. So that's really important. The idea of supporting everybody doesn't mean that everybody has to get the same thing. In fact, expecting everybody to have this identical experience just is against the whole notion of the web. I mean, the web is a heterogeneous environment where people come and go with and can share interoperably content and services through different user agents. And so expecting everybody to have the same thing and enforcing that rigid approach on everybody is just wrong, I think, in my opinion. And the second thing to keep in mind is that by having a graded support, instead of being binary yes, no, but instead of having grades of support, we can provide kind of an appropriate experience to everybody. It's up to the user to determine what tools they have and what experience they're after, whether or not they want images, whether or not they want JavaScript or anything else. It's not our place to make that decision. And so we don't want to exclude everybody again. Another important thing about this is that it really brings sanity to the QA process. So many browsers out there that we really we wanted to support everybody, but we still had to manage our resources and make sure that we were getting the most bang for our buck, I guess. So we wrote a white paper that talks about this in more detail and that is useful to kind of help other people see this perspective. So we've defined kind of 3 grades of support. At the core is C-grade support, or core support. And that's basically just XHTML or HTML and normal href, HTTP requests, just web 0.0, basically. It's only about 2% of our audience. This is Lynx and Netscape 1 and Netscape 4, and these days even IE5 is now a C-grade browser for us. So this is like your underlying foundation. If you write code that is in reasonable markup, that talks to the server through normal hrefs and HTTP requests, it's not concerned with Ajax, that's going to work for everybody, and it takes very little effort. You can just have it out there, and that's your safety net. Once that's in place, then we offer A-grade support to the vast majority of users. This is Firefox and Opera and Safari and IE6 and IE7 and the big browsers on the big operating systems. It's about 96% of our audience. And for those browsers, those known, identified, capable browsers, we do rigorous QA testing. We give our designers pixel precision, and the interaction works exactly as designed, and we assume CSS and JavaScript. So now we're at 98% of the audience. And then there's this other really maddening 2%, which we call kind of the X grade, the X factor. Any given month, we see about 14,000 user agents come ask for our pages. And so the idea that you could test all those is ludicrous, clearly. But But we don't want to exclude those people either, because many of those are great browsers and are fine. Who knows what they are? There's so many of them. But we assume they're capable. So let's see. So the other way to look at this is that C-grade browsers are known to be bad browsers. We know that if we give a bunch of Ajax calls to Netscape 3, it's going to crash and be very upset. And so we identify all those bad browsers on a blacklist, and then we identify all the A-grade browsers on a whitelist, and we say we're going to test on these. We test on them. We support them in every way possible, and then everybody else is out there. Because they're not identified as bad, we assume they're good. So this means things like the beta release of Opera or of Firefox 2.5 or something. We haven't tested on it, so we can't vouch for A-grade support, but we assume it's going to be fine, and so we give it X-grade support. These are our A-grade browsers today. We make this list available publicly, and it's always up to date at that URL. So, just for example, here's what a C-grade experience looks like on Yahoo search. It's all the precision of alignment is gone. All we're getting now is just simple HTML. The A-grade experience and most likely the X-grade experience looks like this. All the JavaScript, all the CSS works. So that's pretty much across the board. Because mail is a kind of still legacy, like I've said a few times now, it's still struggling to give support to these other browsers. It was initially an IE-only project, and so we've actually had to write an IE emulator for Firefox and for Gecko. It's because we have so much IE-specific code in there that we actually have an emulator that pretends it's IE, and it's kind of a nightmare. But everybody else, this concept has swept through the company. Everybody's kind of using this approach now to ensure that we're offering our services to as many people as possible. So just a kind of a closing comment, and then we'll take a few questions, is I always try to keep in mind that if any bad decision we make today is going to be a constraint tomorrow. And if anybody in here has spent time in the last year unnesting tables or migrating font tags to CSS, you know what I'm talking about. I mean, that's the work that we're paying the price for the decisions we made last decade. And so when we talk about Web 2.0 being a chance to get it right the second time, this is what I mean. It's worth taking the time to make decisions that are going to give us as many opportunities as possible tomorrow for the next thing that comes. So even though there's so much excitement right now, take a deep breath and make sure that you're still making kind of sane, logical decisions as we go forward. We're hiring. Questions? Thanks for your attention. Yeah? So the best thing, I kind of stumbled over that description, but the best thing to do is go read that white paper, which really kind of frames the discussion. And then how do we actually do the blacklist and the whitelist for the browser support? We have an Apache module that does browser lookup based on browsecap.ini, which is an open source browser identification toolkit for PHP, I think. So as a request comes in, we check the blacklist. If it's on the blacklist, we don't write out the script or CSS tags. We just send them HTML. And we also send them a message telling them what's going on, giving them a link to more information and a link to download recommended browsers. Once it passed the blacklist, we write out the script tags. And then if it's not on the whitelist, we write out another message saying, you're kind of on your own. But yeah, which is why we haven't released that module yet. We're still fine-tuning a few things, and this is kind of a case of consider what we say, not what we do. If you look at a lot of our pages on Netscape 4, it doesn't necessarily do this yet, but we're getting there, and our development, our tiered development is aiming towards that. Yeah. Can I talk all about Yahoo's plans for Flickr? You can try to. Cal's floating around here somewhere, Cal Henderson. He's the engineering lead for Flickr, so you can ask him. Sorry.
What's your, the front page of Yahoo.com, what kind of target file size? I mean, do you try to limit yourself to no more than a certain size for that front page?
Yeah, so what's the target file size for the home page? No, we don't have a hard and fast target. I think if you load the home page right now and you don't touch your mouse, you don't do anything, the initial load is about 22K, I think. But then once you start interacting with it, it balloons up to about 200. We start bringing in these files on demand. We start getting more data for those different hidden nodes and stuff. So there, it's where kind of this on-demand loading can really pay off. You can have a really sophisticated thing as long as you get it to the user fast. So, any other questions? Another one, yes.
When Internet Explorer 6 starts to become deprecated and fewer and fewer people use it, sooner hopefully better than later, what kind of new capabilities does that going to give us?
So once we can say goodbye to IE6, what will we be able to do? Some of the most exciting stuff for me is a lot of the better CSS support. There's a lot of great CSS selectors that are much more sophisticated for getting attribute-based selectors and some of the other CSS3 selectors. I think that'll really let us bring down our CSS file size quite a bit, and also our markup size. Right now in markup, we write CSS has a pseudo selector called first child, which lets you not have a top border on your first list item or something, which is a common thing you'd want. But that selector is not supported, and so in the markup, we say class equals first child. So we're thinking ahead to when we will be able to support that, but we have to manually do it in markup now. So we look forward to the day that our markup can get even more lean.
Kind of stuff in JavaScript, right?
What's that?
You can still do like the first child kind of stuff in JavaScript, right?
Yep. We try to. One of my beliefs is just to really work with the grain as much as possible. So there are a lot of other tools you can bring to bear, but try to stick with the right tool for the right job as much as possible. Resist the urge to make everything by hand. It is possible, though, yeah. Anybody else? Great. Well, thanks for your time. I'd be happy to chat more later on. Thanks.